They say the hardest part of love is not the goodbye. It is the waking up the next morning and realizing you must still go on. Loss is not a single event. It is 1,000 tiny absences that press against you in the silence of the house, in the empty side of the bed, in the chair left pulled out at the kitchen table. If grief teaches anything, it is this: the world does not pause for your sorrow. Bills still arrive. Children still need dinner. And hearts, even when shattered, must still beat. Angela Williams learned this at 56 years old, on a gray March morning when the phone call came. Her husband, Charles, had been working an overnight shift at the shipping yard. A crane malfunctioned. A cable snapped. By the time she arrived at the hospital, his body was already cooling. 18 years of marriage ended in the sterile glow of fluorescent lights, with the smell of antiseptic in her nose and the sound of a doctor's apology fading into static. Angela remembered one detail most clearly: his hands. Calloused, familiar hands that had lifted their children, painted the porch, prayed beside her at church. They were folded neatly by the nurse like some fragile relic. She had wanted to grab them, shake them, scream at them to move, but they did not. She did not cry that day, not at first. Shock is merciful that way. It wraps the heart in cotton, muffles the sound of its own breaking. She signed papers. She nodded at words she barely understood. Fatality. Instant, we're sorry. She went home to Jordan and Maya, her children now suddenly fatherless, and told them with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Jordan, the older, 26, stood silent, his jaw locked tight. He had always carried himself like a man already carrying burdens. Maya, only 21, collapsed into Angela's arms, sobbing with the kind of unrestrained grief only youth can still allow itself. Angela held her daughter, stroked her hair, and whispered, "We'll be okay. Somehow we'll be okay." But she did not believe it, not yet. Life after Charles became a daily negotiation with survival. Angela had always worked, part-time jobs, freelance tasks, cleaning houses for extra cash. But Charles's steady paycheck had been the spine of their life. Without it, everything sagged. Rent notices came faster. Utility bills piled. Insurance payouts were promised but tied up in paperwork. So Angela worked. She cleaned offices at dawn, folded laundry for a hotel by noon, stocked shelves at a grocery store in the evenings. Sleep became a luxury. Meals were often skipped. Her body, once strong, grew tired, but she told herself fatigue was cheaper than despair. Jordan noticed. "Mom, you can't keep this up," he said one night, watching her rub her swollen ankles after a 12-hour day. "I can," she replied. "I don't have a choice." He wanted to help, and he tried driving for delivery services, taking odd jobs in construction, but his pride wrestled with his reality. He was a man who had dreamed of graduate school, of maybe starting his own business. Now he was back in his childhood home, watching his mother kill herself to keep the lights on. Resentment brewed, though he rarely voiced it. Maya, still in college, worked weekends at a diner. She would come home smelling of grease and coffee, her tips folded carefully into Angela's hands. For groceries, she'd insist. Angela would smile, but once Maya's door closed, she'd weep softly, ashamed her daughter had to carry adult burdens before finishing her degree. The neighborhood saw Angela as a quiet, dignified figure. She still attended Sunday service, still greeted neighbors with a polite nod. But people also whispered. "Poor woman," they said. "Widowed, still working like that." Sympathy in their voices, but also a hint of distance. People fear grief. It reminds them of their own fragility. Angela's house became a place of silent sacrifices. The thermostat stayed low to save on heating. Dinner portions shrank. She let the children eat first and claimed she wasn't hungry. Nights were long stretches of worry, staring at the cracked ceiling, calculating numbers that never added up. Yet in those moments of exhaustion, Angela discovered something she had not expected: resilience. It came quietly, not with trumpets but with small victories. An overdue bill finally paid. Maya's tuition scraped together. A borrowed car kept running another month. Resilience was also in the way she hid her weariness from her children. She practiced smiling in the mirror so they would not see the hollows under her eyes. She sang hymns while washing dishes to disguise the tightness in her throat. She told jokes at breakfast, small, silly jokes, so that laughter would still live in the house where grief wanted to settle. But grief has a way of seeping through cracks. Some nights, when both children were asleep, Angela would sit alone at the kitchen table with Charles's photo. She'd trace his face with her fingers, whispering, "I don't know how to do this without you." And in the silence, the refrigerator humming behind her, she'd feel both utterly alone and fiercely determined. The truth about loss is this: it does not just remove someone you love, it remakes you. Angela had been a wife, now she was only a mother. She had been part of a pair, now she was the whole weight. She carried her children's futures, their grief, their hopes, and their disappointments stacked all atop her own shoulders. There were mornings when she looked in the mirror and did not recognize the woman staring back. Wrinkles carved deeper lines, hair grayed faster. Her hands were rough from chemicals and soap, but her eyes, dark, weary, unyielding, still carried fire. "Lord," she prayed one morning while pulling on her uniform for the cleaning job, "give me strength for one more day, just one more day." That was how she lived now, not in years, not in months, one day at a time. And somewhere beneath all that fatigue, beneath the loss and the sacrifice, a seed of something new waited. She could not see it yet, could not imagine it. But life, even after tragedy, has a way of sending unexpected visitors, moments of grace disguised as strangers. For now, though, Angela's world was work, exhaustion, and the heavy silence of a home missing its anchor. It was the darkness of loss. The second spring after Charles's death arrived without ceremony. Trees blossomed on her street, children dragged bikes across cracked sidewalks, and the air carried the faint scent of cut grass. But Angela felt none of it. Spring was a season for beginnings, and her life had become a cycle of endings. The end of a marriage, the end of sleep-filled nights, the end of feeling like someone's partner instead of everyone's caretaker. One Tuesday morning, she was rushing from her cleaning shift at a downtown law firm to the grocery store where she worked part-time when the heel of her shoe snapped. She stumbled on the sidewalk, groceries spilling from the bag she carried, half-priced bread, dented cans, a small carton of milk. For a moment, the world seemed to pause with her embarrassment. Then a voice behind her. "Here, let me help." She looked up and saw a man in a navy suit kneeling on the sidewalk, picking up cans with hands too well manicured for manual work. His hair was silver, his face lined in a way that spoke of money more than labor. A black car idled at the curb, a driver waiting. Angela muttered thanks and tried to gather her things quickly, hoping to disappear before she felt the sting of pity. "You live around here?" he asked, brushing dust from a can before handing it back. "Yes," she said cautiously. "Why?" He smiled faintly. "Because most people around here don't buy generic soup. That's smart shopping." She blinked, a rich man noticing canned soup. It felt absurd. She gave him a polite nod, shoved the bread back into her bag, and started walking, but he kept pace. "I didn't mean to intrude. My name's Richard Coleman." Angela knew the name. Everyone in the city did. Coleman Development, plastered across billboards, real estate ads, and half the office towers downtown. She froze for a second, unsure if this was real or some strange twist of fate. "I don't need charity," she said firmly, defensive before he even offered anything. Richard raised his palms. "Good, because I wasn't offering it. I just like talking to people, especially people who work hard." Angela almost laughed. People like her rarely attracted the attention of men like him. But there was something disarming about the way he said it, not as if he were making a speech, but as though he actually saw her. She excused herself, thinking that would be the end of it. But a week later, she saw him again. She was mopping the lobby of an apartment complex, ironically one his company owned, when he walked through the revolving door. He stopped, recognition flickering in his eyes. Angela, right? She looked down at her uniform, at the mop in her hand, and wished she could vanish. Yes. Do you always work this hard? He asked. She felt heat rise in her face. Work keeps the lights on. And what about your children? He asked softly. Angela's chest tightened. They're grown, they do what they can. He nodded. That's good, but sometimes even grown children need a little extra hand. There it was, the line she had been waiting for, the entry point to pity. She stiffened, ready to end the conversation. But instead of reaching into his pocket or offering some insulting gesture of money, Richard asked, would Jordan be interested in an internship? My company has openings. Pays well. Real experience, not just coffee runs. Angela stared at him, stunned. She had no idea how he knew her son's name. Then she remembered she must have mentioned it on the sidewalk. He had listened. Really listened. She hesitated. Accepting help felt like betraying the years she had fought to stand on her own. But she also thought of Jordan's face, weary from rejection after rejection, applications tossed into the void. I'll ask him, she said finally. Jordan did not trust the offer at first. Some rich guy just happens to want me in his company. Sounds like charity to me. Angela put a hand on his shoulder. Maybe it's not charity, maybe it's opportunity. Your father wanted more for you than these odd jobs. Jordan sighed, conflicted, but he went. And to everyone's surprise, he thrived. He had a sharp mind for business, a natural eye for numbers, and within months he was earning more than Angela had ever dreamed possible for him. Maya, too, found herself pulled into Richard's orbit. He arranged a scholarship fund through one of his charitable foundations. She called it a miracle. Angela called it uncomfortable, because with every gesture of help, Angela felt the weight of whispers. At church, women gave her polite smiles edged with curiosity. You've been blessed, they said, but their eyes said something else. What did you give in return? On the street, old neighbors nodded, but their conversations grew shorter. She heard fragments of gossip. That Coleman man with Angela Williams must be nice. Angela tried to ignore it, but the words clung like burrs. At night she replayed them, lying awake in the narrow bed she no longer shared with Charles. Richard never seemed to notice, or maybe he did and simply didn't care. He continued showing up in small, unexpected ways, dropping by with dinner for the family, sending books he thought Maya might like, asking Angela questions about her past, her dreams, as though she were more than just a tired woman in work shoes. And that was what unsettled her most. For years, she had defined herself only by survival, a mother, a widow, a worker. Richard looked at her and seemed to see something else, something she had nearly forgotten existed. One evening, as she locked up the diner where she sometimes worked nights, he appeared again. May I walk you home? He asked. It's late, she said warily. All the more reason. They walked in silence under streetlights, the city buzzing around them. At her doorstep, he paused. You know, Angela, he said, people will always talk. About you, about me, about anyone who dares to live differently than expected. But I've learned something in my years. The only voices that matter are the ones in your own home. What do Jordan and Maya think? That's what counts. Angela swallowed. She wanted to believe him. But she also remembered the sharp words Jordan had flung at her earlier that week. We don't need his kind of help, Mom. We need our dignity. She met Richard's gaze, steady and searching. I appreciate what you've done, but I can't be beholden to anyone. Richard smiled almost sadly. Then don't be. Let it be partnership, not debt. The world already takes enough from you. Let someone give you something back. And for the first time in 2 long, grueling years, Angela felt a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. Not romance, not yet, not ever, she told herself, but a flicker of something she had not known she missed, the sense of being seen. She thanked him, closed the door, and leaned against it in the dark. Inside the house, the fridge hummed, the clock ticked, and her children's laughter floated faintly from upstairs. And in that quiet moment, Angela let herself whisper a single word she had not allowed in years. By summer, the Williams household no longer felt the same. On the surface, everything looked brighter. Jordan came home in pressed shirts, his tie loosened after long days at Coleman Development, carrying the faint scent of polished offices and boardroom coffee. Maya's laughter returned. She spent afternoons sketching furniture layouts for her interior design classes, knowing the scholarship had freed her from debt. Angela, for the first time since Charles's death, saw bills paid before their due dates. The fridge was full. The light stayed on, but comfort, like a new coat of paint, can hide cracks without fixing them. Jordan sat at the dinner table one evening, pushing peas across his plate. "You know what people are saying at work, Mom?" he asked suddenly. Angela looked up. "What are they saying? That I got the internship because Coleman's sweet on you, that I didn't earn it, that I'm just the charity case son of some widow he pities." His voice was sharp, his jaw tight. "Jordan," Angela said gently, "you've been working hard, everyone can see that." He slammed his fork down. "Doesn't matter if they can see it, they've already decided, and it's because of him." From across the table, Maya spoke quietly. "You mean Richard?" "Don't say his name like that," Jordan snapped. "Like he's family, he's not." Maya frowned. "He's helped us, Jordan. He didn't have to. Most people wouldn't even look at us." "That's the problem," Jordan shot back. "He looks at us too much, at Mom too much." His eyes burned across the table. "Don't you see it? He wants to buy his way into our lives." Angela felt the air thicken, the old ache of family arguments. She had tried to hold them together after Charles, but now she sensed another fracture forming. "Enough," she said softly, though her voice trembled. "We don't bite the hand that helps us." Jordan stared at her hurt. "Dad would have hated this." The words struck like a knife. Angela's lips parted, but no reply came. Maya pushed back her chair. "That's not fair, Jordan. Dad's gone. Mom's doing her best." She turned to Angela. "And Richard isn't trying to replace him. He's just kind." Jordan scoffed. "Kindness with strings attached isn't kindness, it's control." He stormed out, the screen door slamming behind him. Later that night, Angela found him in the driveway, leaning against his old car. He lit a cigarette, a habit he'd promised her he'd quit, and exhaled into the humid air. "You think I'm ungrateful," he said without looking at her. "I think you're angry," Angela replied. "Of course I'm angry. Dad's gone, and now this man swoops in, plays savior. Everyone thinks I should be grateful, but it makes me feel small." Angela stepped closer. "You're not small, you're my son, you've carried so much already." He finally looked at her, his eyes glistening. "Then why do I feel like I'm being replaced? By him, by his money. By the way Maya talks about him like he's some hero. By the way you," his voice faltered. "By the way you smile when he's around." Angela's chest tightened. She wanted to deny it, to insist that Richard meant nothing beyond generosity. But she also knew Jordan was not entirely wrong. There had been moments, brief, uninvited moments, when she had felt something stir. Gratitude, yes. But also the dangerous memory of what it meant to be seen as a woman, not just a mother. She swallowed hard. "Richard is not your father. No one could ever replace Charles. Not for me, not for you. But Jordan, we can't push away every hand that reaches out. Pride won't keep this family fed." Jordan turned away, crushed the cigarette under his shoe. "Maybe not, but pride's the only thing I've got left of him." Inside the house, Maya sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through photos on her phone. Richard had invited her to a charity gala for students, nothing romantic, just a scholarship event. Yet she glowed as she showed Angela the pictures. "Look, Mom, he introduced me to some designers. Real ones from New York. They said my sketches had potential." Angela smiled faintly. "That's wonderful, baby. You don't understand. No one ever notices me like that. Dad was proud, sure, but he didn't know about design. Richard, he sees it. He listens. She leaned against her mother's shoulder. Sometimes it feels like he's the father I still need. Angela froze. The words were meant innocently, but they carried weight. A father she still needed. A role Richard was quietly, almost invisibly, slipping into. She kissed Maya's forehead and said nothing, but in her heart she felt the rope pulling tighter between her children, each being tugged in different directions. The whispers grew louder. "At church, Mrs." Franklin pulled Angela aside. "Be careful," she said in a tone both warning and judgmental. "Men with money don't give without expecting something back." At the grocery store, a cashier smirked when Angela paid with crisp bills instead of coins. "Guess your luck's turned around, huh?" Angela smiled politely, but her insides churned. Every kindness Richard offered seemed to come with a shadow she couldn't shake off. One Sunday afternoon, Richard himself dropped by. He brought flowers, sunflowers, bright against Angela's modest living room. Jordan walked in just as Richard handed them to her. "Really?" Jordan muttered. "What's next, a diamond necklace?" Richard looked startled, then composed. "Jordan, I know this is difficult." "No," Jordan cut in. "What's difficult is watching my mother be treated like a project, like some charity case you can fix." Maya jumped up. "That's not what he's doing." "Stay out of it, Maya. Don't talk to me like that." The room erupted. Voices overlapping, anger spilling out. Angela pressed her hands to her temples, wishing Charles were there to mediate, to calm them as he once had. Finally she shouted, "Enough!" The room fell silent. Angela stood tall, though her knees trembled. "This family has been through hell. We've lost the man who was our center. We've scraped and sacrificed to survive. And now, when help comes, you're tearing each other apart instead of standing together. I won't allow it." Her voice broke, but her eyes held steady. "Do you understand me?" Maya's lip quivered. Jordan looked away. Richard stood awkwardly, flowers still in his hand. For a moment, Angela felt all their lives hanging by a thread. One wrong word and everything could snap. Jordan finally muttered, "Yes, ma'am," and stormed out again. Maya sank onto the couch, arms crossed. Richard set the flowers down quietly, as if aware they now carried the weight of accusation instead of gratitude. Angela closed her eyes, exhausted. The cracks were spreading. Judgment has a sound. It's the whisper you hear when you pass by two neighbors on their porches. It's the pause in a conversation when you step into a room. It's the glance, half pity, half suspicion, that lingers longer than kindness should. Angela began to hear it everywhere. At church, the place that had once been her refuge, she now felt exposed. On Sundays, she sat in the same pew she and Charles had shared for years, her children beside her, the hymns rising like incense, but the stairs pressed harder than the music could lift. "Blessed woman," the pastor said once from the pulpit, glancing at her. "The Lord sends help to those in need." The congregation nodded, some smiling, some not. Angela felt the words land on her like a brand, as if her life had become a parable of widowhood and wealth, her struggles a sermon illustration. After service, Mrs. Franklin cornered her in the fellowship hall. "Angela, honey," she said, voice dripping with concern that didn't feel like concern at all, "we've all noticed how close Mr. Coleman has been with you. Just be careful. These things can turn into talk." Angela forced a smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Franklin. I'll keep that in mind." But the damage was done. All afternoon she replayed those words we've all noticed. They weren't just seeing her anymore. They were measuring her. On her street, too, the whispers traveled. Angela came home one evening to find her neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, watering his lawn. He gave her a nod. "Evening, Miss Williams. Heard you've been keeping fine company these days." Angela stiffened. "I keep company with my children, Mr. Jenkins." He chuckled, shaking his head. "That ain't what folks are saying." That night, she cried quietly at the kitchen sink, her hands still wet from dishes. She hadn't asked for any of this, the help, the attention, the speculation. She had only wanted to keep her family alive. Jordan, meanwhile, seemed to absorb the whispers like poison. One evening, he came home late, the smell of beer faint on his breath. He dropped his keys on the counter and said flatly, "You know what they call me at work now? Rich boy, Coleman's kid." Angela looked up from folding laundry. "You're not anyone's kid but mine." "Tell that to them," he snapped. "Tell that to the men in the office who laugh behind my back. Tell it to the ones who say I wouldn't be there if Coleman didn't have his eye on my mother." Angela's chest tightened. "Jordan, you can't let people's words define you." "They don't just define me, Mom. They define you. Don't you see? They think you're cheap, that you're selling yourself for favors." His voice cracked, but his eyes blazed with anger. Angela's hands froze on the towel. For a moment, she felt as though he had slapped her. "Is that what you think too?" she asked quietly. Jordan's lips parted, but no words came. He shook his head violently, as if trying to rid himself of thoughts he hated but could not silence. "I don't know what to think anymore." He stormed upstairs, leaving the smell of his frustration hanging in the air. Maya, on the other hand, clung to Richard's presence like a lifeline. She came home from another scholarship event, her face lit with excitement. "Mom, he introduced me to an architect who offered to mentor me. Do you realize what this means? I could have a future in design, an actual future." Angela smiled weakly. "That's wonderful, baby." But inside, she wondered if Maya's joy would survive the world's cruelty. She imagined the day her daughter's friends or colleagues might whisper the same things. She only got ahead because of him. The thought made her stomach turn. One Saturday, Richard invited the family to dinner at an upscale restaurant. Maya dressed eagerly, her curls bouncing, her eyes bright. Jordan resisted but came along, stiff in his suit. Angela wore a simple navy dress, one Charles had once complimented. She felt awkward, out of place, as they stepped into a world of polished silverware and hushed service. The evening began politely enough. Richard spoke warmly about opportunities, about believing in hard work, about wanting to support young people who reminded him of his own children. But halfway through the meal, Jordan's patience snapped. "So what is this really about?" he asked, his fork clattering onto the plate. Richard looked puzzled. "What do you mean? Why us? Out of all the families you could help, why my mom? Why our family?" Angela shot him a warning glance. "Jordan?" "No, I want to hear it," Jordan pressed. His voice was low but seething. "Everyone else thinks it's obvious. You want her, you're buying your way in, so tell me if they are right." The table froze. Maya gasped. Angela's face flushed hot. Richard set his glass down carefully. "Jordan, I understand your anger. I would probably feel the same if I were in your shoes, but I am not buying anyone. Your mother is a remarkable woman. She works harder than anyone I've ever seen. She deserves support, you all do." Jordan leaned back, arms crossed. "That's not an answer." Angela's hands trembled under the table. She wanted to defend herself, to defend Richard, but the words stuck in her throat. Maya finally spoke, her voice sharp. "Why are you so determined to hate him, Jordan? He's helping us. He believes in us." Jordan glared at her. "You sound like you want him to be Dad." The words hung in the air like smoke. Maya's face crumpled. Angela shut her eyes. Richard looked down at his plate, silent. The rest of the dinner passed in strained small talk, the food untouched. That night, when they returned home, Angela sat alone in the kitchen after the children went to bed. The flowers Richard had brought last week still sat wilting in a vase. She touched one of the petals, brittle between her fingers, and whispered to the empty room, "Lord, what am I supposed to do?" The house was quiet, but she could still hear the voices outside its walls, the neighbors, the co-workers, the congregation. Be careful. Men with money don't give without expecting something back. She thought of Charles. What would he say now? Would he be proud of her for surviving, or ashamed of the way she'd let another man into their lives, even at the edges? Tears slid down her cheeks. She wiped them away quickly, as though even her grief might be judged. The shadow of judgment stretched long across her days, threatening to undo the fragile progress she and her children had made. And deep in her heart, Angela feared the cracks were no longer just in the family. They were in her, too. The breaking of a family doesn't happen with one loud explosion. It happens with small fractures, the slammed doors, the silences at dinner, the words spoken too quickly to be taken back. And then one night, all those fractures finally give way. It was a Wednesday evening when it happened. Angela had worked a double shift, her body aching as she pulled off her shoes by the door. The house was heavy with silence. Jordan sat at the table, papers scattered in front of him, a beer half empty. Maya was curled on the couch, scrolling her phone, earbuds in. Angela dropped her bag, forcing a tired smile. "How was everyone's day?" Jordan didn't look up. "Don't you already know?" Her brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" He pushed the papers forward, printouts from news articles. Headlines about Richard Coleman, about his company's latest development project, about his wealth. And in one corner of a local blog, a blurry photo, Angela, leaving a restaurant with Richard, taken after the disastrous family dinner. The caption read, "Is Coleman's generosity just business or something more personal?" Angela's stomach sank. She reached for the papers, but Jordan's hand slammed down on them. "Do you see this?" His voice shook with rage. "This is what people think of you, of us. You're turning our family into a sideshow." Maya pulled her earbuds out. "Jordan, stop." "No, she needs to hear it," he snapped. "Mom, you're letting this man drag Dad's name through the mud. You think he's helping us? He's humiliating us." Angela steadied her breath. "Jordan, I can't control what people write. I can only control how we live, and right now Richard's help is keeping us afloat." Jordan stood, his chair scraping hard against the floor. "Afloat? You call this afloat? You call being whispered about, pitied, laughed at, being saved by some rich old man, afloat?" Maya jumped in, her voice sharp. "At least he cares, at least he's doing something. What have you done, Jordan, except complain?" Jordan's eyes blazed. "I'm trying to protect us." "Protect us?" Maya shot back. "You're protecting your pride, not Mom." Angela's heart pounded. Her children, the only two people she had left, were tearing each other apart right in front of her. She raised her hands, trembling. "Stop it, both of you, please." But Jordan pressed on, his voice rising. "Do you even care what Dad would think? He broke his back for this family. And now, a year after he's gone, you let another man step into his place. Do you even love him anymore, or have you just replaced him?" The words sliced through the room like glass. Angela gasped as if struck. "Don't you dare," she whispered, her voice low but fierce. "Don't you dare say I've replaced your father." Jordan's chest heaved. "Then prove it. Walk away from Coleman. Show us you don't need him." The silence that followed was suffocating. Angela's eyes burned with unshed tears. Finally, her voice broke. "Do you think I want this life? Do you think I enjoy scrubbing floors, working myself sick, begging God every night for enough strength to keep going? Do you think I wanted to take help from another man?" She pressed a hand to her chest, shaking. "I do it for you, for both of you. Every sacrifice, every humiliation, every judgmental look, I take it so you don't have to." Her tears spilled then, hot and unrelenting. "I buried my husband. I held this family together with duct tape and prayer, and now my own son looks at me like I'm a disgrace." Maya was already crying, covering her mouth. Jordan's face faltered, guilt flickering behind his anger, but he didn't back down. "You're not a disgrace, Mom," he said quietly, "but you don't see what this is doing to us, to me, to Dad's memory." Angela sank into a chair, her body folding in on itself. She had nothing left to fight with, only exhaustion and grief that never seemed to loosen its grip. Maya rushed to her side, wrapping her arms around her. "Mom, you're not a disgrace, you're everything. You're the only reason we're still standing." She glared at Jordan through tears. "And you should be thanking her, not tearing her down." Jordan turned away, his shoulders rigid. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. He grabbed his keys and walked out, the door slamming so hard the windows rattled. The house fell silent, except for Angela's quiet sobs and Maya's trembling voice. "Mom, don't listen to him. He's angry. He doesn't mean it." But Angela knew anger was only the mask. Beneath it was a wound that none of them had figured out how to heal. She wiped her eyes, forcing herself to breathe. "I've failed him," she whispered. Maya shook her head fiercely. "No, he's just lost, like the rest of us. But you're the reason we haven't fallen apart completely. Don't ever think you've failed." Angela held her daughter close, her tears soaking into Maya's hair. In that moment, she felt both the deepest ache and the faintest thread of strength. Because even as her son drifted further away, her daughter clung tighter. And somewhere inside, Angela knew that the real breaking point wasn't this fight. It was the choice that loomed ahead. Whether to keep accepting Richard's hand, with all the judgment it carried, or to turn away and risk everything unraveling again. For now, all she could do was sit in the darkness of her kitchen, the weight of her children's futures pressing down, and whisper the same prayer she had whispered since the day Charles died. "Lord, give me enough strength for tomorrow." The next day, Angela almost didn't answer the phone when it rang. She was still hollow from the fight with Jordan, her eyes swollen, her voice brittle. But the name on the screen, Richard Coleman, stared at her until she finally pressed accept. "Angela," his voice said, gentle, "would you meet me? Just for a walk, nothing more." She hesitated. Every instinct told her to hide, to retreat until the shame faded. Yet another voice inside whispered that she needed to hear something beyond whispers and judgments. An hour later, she found herself at the park by the river, where the air smelled faintly of honeysuckle and children's laughter drifted from the playground. Richard was waiting on a bench, his hands folded, his expression not of a man used to commanding rooms, but of someone carrying a quiet heaviness. "Thank you for coming," he said as she sat down, leaving a polite space between them. Angela clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "I don't know how much longer I can do this. The looks, the talk, my own son resents me." Richard nodded slowly. "People talk because it's easier than looking at their own lives. And your son, he's grieving even if it doesn't look like it. Anger is sometimes just grief in disguise." Angela turned to him. "Why us, Richard? Why me? Out of all the people in this city, why did you decide to help me?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the water, sunlight catching the ripples. Then, in a voice quieter than she'd ever heard from him, he began. "I had a son," he said. "His name was Michael. He'd be about Jordan's age now, 26. Angela stilled. Richard's jaw tightened. "He was bright, charming. Everyone said he'd take over the business someday, but he got lost. Drugs, bad friends, too much money too soon. I thought I could fix it. I threw money at rehab, lawyers, doctors. Nothing worked. He died of an overdose in a hotel room I paid for." His hands shook slightly as he rubbed them together. "And I have to live every day knowing I couldn't save him, that all my power, all my wealth meant nothing against his demons." Angela's heart clenched. She had known tragedy, but to lose a child, it was a pain she had feared more than her own widowhood. "And my wife," Richard continued, voice heavy, "she never forgave me. She said I was too busy with deals and skyscrapers to notice the boy under my own roof. She left 2 years later. Cancer took her not long after that." He shook his head, eyes glassy. "So I buried a son and then a wife, and all the buildings in the world couldn't fill the hole they left." Angela swallowed hard, her throat aching. "Richard, I didn't know. Most people don't," he said with a weary smile. "The papers called it a family tragedy, then moved on. But I didn't. I carry it every day. And when I saw you that morning on the sidewalk, groceries spilled, tired but still standing, I saw someone who refused to collapse under the weight. Someone who reminded me of the strength I wished I'd given my own family." He turned to her fully now, his voice trembling. Helping you isn't charity, Angela, it's atonement, maybe even redemption. I can't save what I lost, but I can honor it by standing with someone still fighting. Angela's eyes blurred with tears she hadn't expected. For months, she had carried the shame of whispers, of being seen as a burden, a woman taking favors she didn't deserve. But here was the truth. Richard wasn't saving her. He was saving himself, too. She looked at him, really looked at him, not as the untouchable tycoon in tailored suits, but as a father hollowed out by grief, a man trying to stitch meaning back into a torn life. For the first time since Charles's death, she felt a flicker of connection with someone who understood the language of loss. "Richard," she said softly, "I'm sorry for what you've carried, truly." He shook his head. "Don't be, just let me do something good with what's left of me." They sat in silence then, the river glinting gold in the late afternoon sun. Angela felt the tightness in her chest ease just a little. She wasn't sure what this new understanding meant or where it would lead. But she knew one thing: Richard's help was not pity. It was born of scars as deep as her own. When she finally stood to leave, he touched her arm lightly, not possessive, not demanding, just steady. "Angela, whatever happens, know this: you are not alone in your fight, not anymore." She walked home slowly, his words echoing in her ears. And for the first time in months, the whispers of judgment seemed softer, almost drowned out by something stronger. Not shame, not suspicion. Compassion. The following week, Angela found herself in a world she never thought she'd enter. Richard had invited her and the kids to a fundraising gala downtown. "It's nothing extravagant," he'd promised with a gentle smile. "Just dinner and speeches. You'll be my guests." Angela almost said no. The thought of walking into a ballroom full of strangers in glittering gowns and tuxedos made her stomach churn. But Maya was thrilled. She borrowed a dress from a friend and twirled in front of the mirror. Even Jordan, though reluctant, agreed to come after some prodding. "If nothing else," he muttered, "at least the food will be decent." When they arrived, Angela felt the weight of every eye in the room. She smoothed the simple navy dress she'd borrowed from a neighbor, painfully aware of how it contrasted with the sequins and silks around her. Richard, however, seemed unfazed. He guided them with quiet confidence, introducing Angela not as a charity case but as a dear friend. Still, whispers followed. "She caught fragments, that's her. Widowed, isn't she? Strange, isn't it?" At their table, Richard's sister Evelyn leaned forward, her diamond earrings catching the light. She was elegant, every hair in place, and her smile didn't reach her eyes. "So," Evelyn said, voice smooth as glass, "you must be Angela. Richard speaks so highly of you." Angela offered a polite nod. "It's kind of him to say so." Evelyn's gaze slid to Jordan and Maya. "And these are your children. Lovely, you must be very proud." "I am," Angela said, straightening slightly. The pause that followed was deliberate. Then Evelyn added, "It can't be easy, raising them alone. You must be very grateful for Richard's generosity." Angela stiffened. She heard the insinuation, the unspoken question: "Are you here for him, or for what he can give you?" Jordan shifted uncomfortably. Maya bristled, but Angela placed a calming hand on her daughter's knee beneath the table. She forced a gentle smile. "Grateful, yes, but more for his kindness than his money." Evelyn tilted her head, unconvinced. "Kindness and money tend to look the same, don't they?" Before Angela could respond, Richard returned from greeting a business partner. He caught the tension in the air, his jaw tightening. "Evelyn, don't interrogate my guests." His sister laughed lightly, touching his arm. "Just making conversation." But the seed had been planted. Later that evening, as Angela stepped away to catch her breath near the balcony, another figure approached. Thomas Greer, one of Richard's longtime associates. He was older, with sharp eyes that seemed to measure people the way a jeweler inspects stones. "Mrs. Williams," he said warmly, but the warmth was rehearsed. "Richard's been very invested in you and your family." Angela folded her arms. He's been kind, yes. Greer leaned closer. Forgive me for being blunt, but people talk. They wonder if this is wise, for Richard, I mean. He's a generous man, but generous men attract opportunists. The words hit Angela like cold water. I am not an opportunist, Mr. Greer. He raised his hands as if in peace. I don't say that you are, but perception matters. And right now, the perception isn't flattering. Angela stared at him, her heart pounding. She wanted to walk away to tell him his opinion didn't matter, but she knew it did. In Richard's world, perception was everything. By the end of the evening, Angela felt as though she had walked through fire. Every smile carried a question mark, every handshake a hint of suspicion. She held herself together for Maya, who was still glowing from the experience, and for Jordan, whose silence told her more than words could. When they got home, Jordan finally spoke. Do you see? This is exactly what I meant. Angela sank into the couch, exhausted. Jordan, it's not that simple. He stood over her, his voice tight. Mom, they think you're using him, they think we're using him, and honestly, sometimes I wonder if they're right. The words sliced deeper than Evelyn's barbs, deeper than Greer's veiled warnings. Her own son doubted her heart. Maya slammed her hands on the table. Stop it, Jordan. You didn't see how Mom looked tonight. Like she didn't belong, like every step she took was a fight. She's not using him, she's surviving. Angela pressed her palms to her face, tears pricking her eyes. Enough, she whispered. The house fell quiet. In that silence, she thought of Richard's confession in the park, of the grief that drove his generosity. She thought of Evelyn's cold smile, of Greer's warning, of Jordan's bitter words. She thought of how quickly kindness turned into suspicion when money was involved. Wealth, she realized, was not just a gift. It was a trap. It drew eyes, questions, judgments, pulling her family into a spotlight they never asked for. And yet, without it, what would they have? More debt, more exhaustion, more nights wondering how to keep the lights on. Angela lay awake long after the house was quiet, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, she asked herself not if she could survive without Richard's help, but if she could survive with it. The morning after the gala, the house was unusually quiet. Angela moved through the kitchen like a ghost, her hands mechanically pouring coffee, her eyes distant. Jordan had already left for work without a word. Maya lingered at the table, watching her mother with concern. Mom, she said softly, don't listen to them. Those people last night, they don't know you, they don't know us. Angela forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. It's not just them, baby. It's your brother too. He's starting to believe them. Maya's jaw tightened. Then he's being stubborn. He won't see what's right in front of him, that you're holding everything together. Angela touched her daughter's hand. He's hurting, and sometimes hurt makes us lash out at the people closest to us. But even as she said it, her heart ached. Jordan's words, sometimes I wonder if they are right, had pierced her deeper than she wanted to admit. That afternoon, Richard called. Angela, come by the office. There's something I'd like to discuss. She hesitated. The last thing she wanted was more whispers, more suspicious eyes, but something in his voice sounded urgent. When she arrived, Richard led her not into his sleek glass office, but into a smaller room lined with bookshelves and leather chairs. It felt less like a boardroom and more like a study. He handed her an envelope. Inside was a check. A number so large Angela's breath caught in her throat. I want you to have this, Richard said gently. For the house, for the kids, for peace of mind. Angela's hands shook. Richard, I can't. You can, he interrupted softly. And you should. You've carried burdens no one should carry alone. Let me help. Her eyes blurred with tears. Do you understand what this looks like? To everyone else, to my son? Richard's expression darkened. Evelyn, Greer, the others, I know what they say, but Angela, let them talk. They've never lived a day in your shoes. Angela pressed the envelope back into his hands. I can't accept this. Not like this. It will only drive Jordan further away. Richard sighed, rubbing his temple. Angela, I respect your pride, but pride doesn't keep the lights on. Before she could answer, a knock came at the door. It was Evelyn. She stepped inside, her voice smooth. "Am I interrupting?" Richard stiffened. "Yes." But she ignored him, turning her sharp gaze on Angela. "Richard, the board is already uneasy. They see you writing checks, bringing her into our events. It doesn't look good." Angela's face flushed. "I don't want your money, Evelyn. I never asked for it." "Then why are you here?" Evelyn's words were a knife wrapped in silk. Richard's voice cut through, hard as steel. "Enough. Angela is my friend and my decisions are not up for debate." Evelyn raised her brows. "Friendship, is that what we're calling it?" Angela's stomach twisted. She wanted to vanish, to escape the suffocating scrutiny. She stood abruptly. "I should go." Richard reached for her hand. "Angela," but she pulled away. "I can't be the reason your family doubts you, or mine." She left without looking back. At home that evening, Jordan was waiting. He held the same envelope Richard had given her, now crumpled at the edges. "Where did this come from?" His voice was sharp, demanding. Angela froze. Richard must have sent it after she left, quietly, stubbornly, as if determined to help no matter her protests. "It's not what you think," she said carefully. "What do I think, Mom? That you're taking handouts from a billionaire? That you're trading our dignity for his pity?" "Jordan," Maya snapped, stepping between them, "don't you dare talk to her like that." But Jordan's fury only deepened. "You don't get it, Maya. This isn't help, it's control. It's him buying his way into our lives, and Mom is letting him." Angela's chest heaved. "I never asked for this, Jordan. I told him no, but he," her voice cracked, "he doesn't take no easily." Jordan threw the envelope onto the table. "Exactly, and soon we won't be able to say no at all." Maya's eyes blazed. "You're so blind. You'd rather see us struggle, see Mom break her back every day than let someone care about us." "I'd rather see us stand on our own feet," Jordan shot back. Angela pressed her palms to the counter, her strength wavering. The room felt like it was splitting in two, her son on one side, her daughter on the other, and she in the middle, fraying at the seams. Finally, her voice broke. "Stop it, please. Do you think this is easy for me? Every dollar feels like a weight. Every whisper feels like a knife. I'm trying to survive, Jordan, that's all, to keep this family together." Jordan's expression softened for a flicker of a second, but he shook his head. "You think you're keeping us together, but you're pushing me away." And with that, he walked out, the door slamming behind him again. Maya rushed to Angela's side, tears streaming. "Mom, don't listen to him. He'll come around, he has to." Angela sank into a chair, trembling. She wasn't so sure anymore. Each slam of the door felt like a fracture she couldn't mend. And yet, in the hollow quiet of the house, she knew the truth. Wealth wasn't just a blessing. It was a wedge. And unless she found a way to navigate it, she might lose the one thing she couldn't bear to lose, her family. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that didn't feel restful but tense, like the air before a storm. Jordan had stayed out late for the second night in a row. Maya kept glancing at her phone, hoping for a text from her brother, while Angela busied herself in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes that were already clean. Her hands worked, but her mind churned. Every slam of the door, every whispered rumor at the gala, every envelope she hadn't asked for, all of it spun in her chest until she could hardly breathe. That night, after Maya had gone to bed, Angela sat alone at the table. She opened her worn leather notebook, the one she'd used for grocery lists and budgeting since Charles had died. She flipped past old numbers scrawled in hurried ink and turned to a blank page. At the top she wrote, in steady letters, "How to stand on my own again." For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine life without Richard's safety net. The thought was terrifying, but also strangely freeing. She listed her options: more work hours. She already worked herself thin, but maybe there were shifts she could trade, late-night jobs no one wanted. Freelance design. She still had her skills from years ago. She could dust off her old portfolio, start small, maybe build a client base. Community support. Churches, nonprofits, neighbors, not charity, partnership. Places where help came without judgment or strings. She paused, her pen hovering. Then she wrote one more line, dignity first, always dignity. For too long, she realized, she had been living in survival mode, grateful for any lifeline, even if it came wrapped in suspicion. But survival wasn't enough anymore. She needed to live, to reclaim her family's respect, to show Jordan she wasn't anyone's project. The next morning, Angela woke before dawn. She packed a thermos of coffee, pulled on her coat, and walked down the quiet street to the library. The doors opened at 8, and she was the first inside. She logged into one of the public computers and typed freelance graphic design jobs into the search bar. It felt like stepping back into a part of herself she'd left behind. She uploaded her old work samples, polished them, and began sending applications. It wasn't much, but it was something, a seed planted. That afternoon, Richard called again. "Angela, let me stop by, just for a little while." She hesitated, then agreed. When he arrived, he brought groceries, bags of produce, bread, and fresh meat. He carried them into the kitchen as if he belonged there, his presence filling the small house. "Richard," Angela said gently, "you don't need to keep doing this." "I want to," he replied simply. He unpacked the food with practiced ease. "I told you I can't undo the past, but I can be useful now." Angela looked at him, seeing both the sincerity and the weight behind his eyes. She didn't doubt his intentions, but intentions weren't enough to protect her family from the whispers or from Jordan's growing anger. She chose her words carefully. "I appreciate everything you've done, truly, but I need to find my own footing again, for Jordan, for myself." Richard froze, a loaf of bread still in his hands. Slowly, he set it down. "Are you saying you don't want me in your life?" Angela shook her head. "I'm saying I don't want to lean on you so heavily. People talk, Richard. They question my motives, my integrity, and my son," her voice cracked. "My son looks at me like I've betrayed him. I can't live like that." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then, softly, he asked, "And what about you, Angela? What do you want?" The question stunned her. No one had asked her that since Charles died. She had been living for Jordan, for Maya, for survival. What did she want? Her throat tightened. "I want peace. I want my children to respect me. I want to look in the mirror and see a woman who stood on her own 2 feet." Richard's expression softened, but his eyes were shadowed. "If that's what you want, I'll respect it. But please don't shut me out completely. I'm not just here to give money. I'm here because I care." Angela's chest ached. She believed him, yet she also knew caring could become another kind of chain if she wasn't careful. That evening, Jordan came home late again, the smell of alcohol clinging faintly to him. Angela waited at the table. "Jordan," she began gently, "we need to talk." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "If this is about Coleman again—" "It's not," she cut in. "It's about me. I've started looking for freelance work. Graphic design, something I can do on my own terms." Jordan blinked, surprised. "You're really doing that?" She nodded. "Yes, because I want you to know I don't need to rely on anyone else. Not Richard, not anyone. I need you to believe in me again." For the first time in weeks, Jordan's eyes softened. "I just want you to be okay, Mom." Angela reached for his hand. "Then trust me, I will be." He squeezed her fingers briefly before pulling away, his walls still up but showing the faintest crack. That night, Angela wrote another line in her notebook. "I am more than my survival. I am rebuilding." It was the beginning of a vow, quiet but resolute. A mother's silent resolve to carve a new path, not only for her children, but for herself. And as she closed the notebook, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Storms never arrive all at once. They brew quietly, hidden in the air, until suddenly the sky splits open. Angela had felt the storm coming for weeks, in the slammed doors, the suspicious stares, the quiet ache in her son's voice. And when it broke, it was not in whispers or passing arguments, but in a night no one in her family would forget. It began with Richard's insistence. He showed up on a Friday evening with a box in his hands. Angela opened the door to find him standing there, rain dripping from his coat, the box held tightly against his chest. "What is this?" she asked, already weary. "Something for you," he said, stepping inside. He placed the box on the table and opened it. Inside was a laptop, sleek and new, along with a printer and design software. "If you're serious about your freelance work, you need the right tools. Consider it an investment." Angela's breath caught. She wanted to refuse, to tell him no, but the truth was she needed those tools. Her old computer barely started anymore, and every application she sent out took hours of frustration. This gift could change everything, but before she could answer, the front door opened. Jordan walked in, wet from the rain, his eyes falling instantly on the box. His face darkened. "What's this now?" Angela's heart dropped. "Jordan," Richard tried to speak. "It's just some equipment to help your mother with her design work." Jordan's laugh was bitter. "Of course. Always swooping in, always saving the day. Do you ever stop?" "Jordan, please," Angela said softly. But Jordan's anger had been building too long. He stepped closer to Richard. "You think we don't see what you're doing? You think throwing money around makes you our hero? You're buying your way into this family, and you're using my mom to do it." Richard's face tightened. "That's not fair. I'm only trying to help." "Help?" Jordan's voice cracked with fury. "You're trying to replace Dad. That's what this is. You couldn't save your own family, so now you're taking mine." The words hung in the air like thunder. Angela gasped, her hands trembling. She looked at Richard, whose eyes filled with a pain he didn't try to hide. For a moment he looked smaller, fragile, stripped of his polished armor. "Jordan," Angela whispered, "that's enough." "No, it's not enough," he shouted. "We let this man into our lives, and now everyone whispers about us like we're parasites. I can't even walk down the street without hearing it. You may not care about our name, but I do. I won't let him turn us into his charity project." Maya's voice cut through, sharp and desperate. "Jordan, stop. You don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do." His chest heaved as he turned to his mother. "Tell me the truth, Mom. Do you even love him?" The room froze. Richard's eyes turned toward her, searching, pleading. Maya stared, horrified. And Angela felt the weight of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every whispered prayer crushing down on her. Her voice trembled. "I never asked for love, Jordan. I asked for survival." Jordan's expression broke, raw and wounded. "Then maybe survival cost us everything that mattered." He grabbed his coat and stormed out into the rain, the door slamming so hard the walls shook. Angela stood there shaking, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Maya rushed to her side, tears in her eyes. "Mom, don't listen to him. He's hurting. He doesn't mean it." But Angela knew he did mean it, at least in this moment. His words had come from the deepest place of grief, the wound he'd never allowed to heal. She turned to Richard then, her voice hollow. "You should go." Richard shook his head. "Angela, please." "Go," she repeated, firmer now. His eyes searched hers, filled with something between sorrow and regret. Finally, he nodded. He gathered his coat, glanced once at the box on the table, and whispered, "I never meant to cause this." Then he was gone. The rain outside battered the windows, fierce and relentless. Angela sank into a chair, her face in her hands, her body racked with sobs. Maya knelt beside her, clinging tightly. "Mom, we'll get through this," Maya whispered, though her own tears betrayed her fear. But Angela wasn't sure anymore. The storm she had tried to hold back had broken loose, and now everything she loved felt at risk of being washed away. Still, as she sat there, drenched in grief, a small voice rose within her. A mother's voice, a fighter's voice. "You can't give up now, not when they still need you." Angela wiped her tears, forcing herself to breathe. Jordan was lost in his pain. Richard was trapped in his past. Maya was holding on, but barely. And she was the hinge on which it all turned. She didn't know how, but she would find a way. Even if it meant walking through this storm alone. The storm outside had passed by morning. The streets glistened with rainwater and the air smelled like earth and beginnings. But inside Angela's heart, the storm still raged. Jordan hadn't come home that night. She sat at the kitchen table, waiting, listening for the sound of his key in the lock, her eyes burning from sleeplessness. Maya had fallen asleep on the couch, her head resting on a pillow, clutching a blanket like a child. It wasn't until dawn that the door finally opened. Jordan stepped inside, his clothes damp, his face pale with exhaustion. Angela rose slowly, her body heavy with both relief and fear. "Jordan," she whispered. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes downcast. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, in a voice cracked with fatigue, he said, "I'm sorry." Angela's tears spilled freely. She moved toward him, her hands trembling as they touched his face. "Oh, my boy," she breathed. "I never wanted to hurt you. Everything I've done, every sacrifice, every mistake, it's always been for you and your sister." Jordan's voice broke. "I just miss him, Mom. I miss Dad so much, and when I see Coleman, I feel like he's trying to take his place. And I hate myself for even thinking that about you." Angela pulled him into her arms, holding him like she had when he was small. "No one will ever take your father's place," she said fiercely. "Not for me, not for you. He lives in us, in every laugh we share, in every step we take forward. I will never forget him, and I will never replace him." Jordan clung to her then, his shoulders shaking. For the first time in months, his walls crumbled and the grief he'd carried alone poured out. Maya woke and rushed to them, wrapping her arms around both. And there, in their small living room, the three of them wept together, not in despair, but in release. Later that week, Angela met Richard at the park by the river, the same place where he had once confessed his story. He looked weary, his eyes cautious. "I wanted to say thank you," Angela told him, "for everything you've done, but I need you to understand, I can't keep living under the shadow of your generosity. It's breaking my family apart." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. He nodded slowly. "I understand. It was never my intention to hurt you. I only wanted to help." "And you did," Angela said gently. "But help isn't about rescuing someone, it's about walking beside them. And right now, I need to walk on my own." For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders sagged and he offered a faint smile. "You're stronger than you realize, Angela, stronger than most people I've ever met." She smiled back, bittersweet. "I had no choice." They parted on good terms with a quiet understanding. Richard would remain a friend, but nothing more, not a savior, not a shadow over her family's name. Months passed. Angela's freelance work slowly grew, first one client, then another. Her notebook filled with lists of projects, deadlines, goals. She still worked nights at the diner, but now with purpose, knowing the day would come when she wouldn't need to anymore. Maya thrived, throwing herself into her studies and helping Angela with design ideas. Jordan, though still scarred by grief, began to soften. He started stopping by the kitchen table while Angela worked, offering advice on layouts, sometimes even making her laugh with sarcastic jokes. One night, as they sat together after dinner, Jordan spoke quietly. "You were right, Mom, about dignity, about standing on your own. I see it now." Angela reached across the table, taking his hand. "We'll always stand, Jordan. Even when we bend, even when we break, we stand again." And for the first time since Charles's death, she saw hope in both her children's eyes. Angela knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more storms, more whispers, more challenges. But she also knew something she hadn't known before, that her family could weather them. That strength wasn't about never falling, it was about rising together after every fall. On a warm spring evening, Angela sat on the porch with Maya and Jordan, the three of them sharing lemonade and laughter as the sun dipped low. The house, once heavy with grief, now felt lighter, as if love had stitched it back together piece by fragile piece. Angela looked at her children, at the family she had fought for, and whispered a prayer of gratitude. For survival, for dignity, for love that endured loss and came out stronger. And as the sky deepened into twilight, she finally felt what she had been searching for all along. Peace, a personal word to you. Thank you for walking through this story with Angela and her family. Stories like this remind us that even in the darkest storms, there is always light to be found, through sacrifice, through love, through the courage to begin again. I wish you and your loved ones good health, lasting peace, and happiness in your family. May your own homes be filled with strength, forgiveness, and the quiet beauty of love that never gives up. With gratitude, the author.